Hi, my name is Steve Goodman. I'm a technical writer at Red Hat. I work on Red Hat Virtualization. Today I'm going to talk about putting oVirt documentation first. Some changes we're making in the documentation process for oVirt and Red Hat Virtualization. Once upon a time, there were two identical twins. Separated at birth, they nonetheless remained close. One was dressed in red, the other was dressed in blue, sometimes in green, and thus were they called Red and Blue. Both Red and Blue were beloved by all those who knew them. Red grew up waited upon by a host of servants, while Blue depended on the kindness of her sister Red. Red shared her finery with Blue, when she remembered to. Blue also had many admirers who gave her whatever they could, although it was difficult for them to find the time after a long day of work. And Blue shared these gifts with Red too, though they were fewer in number. One day, one of these admirers, whose name was Sandy, stood up and said, "It's not fair! Blue deserves to be treated better." And Sandy was so convincing that Red servants began to think about how they could bring as much happiness to Blue as they did to Red. After much discussion and collaboration in the open source way, Red servants hit upon an idea of how they could bring more happiness to Blue while continuing to give Red what she required. This is their story. Our twins, Red and Blue. And here's the real-life story. oVirt and Red Hat Virtualization share most of the same user documentation. The Red Hat Virtualization documentation team writes most of it. Up to now, we wrote and published for Red Hat Virtualization first, and then, when we had time, we synced to oVirt. Now, we are moving to an upstream first documentation model. I'm going to talk about why we're making this move, share where we are in the process, and give you some information that you can use to contribute to oVirt documentation. Most oVirt documentation comes from Red Hat Virtualization technical writers. Red Hat Virtualization must have a private documentation repository, and oVirt must have a public one. But we have a problem. There's no automation to share between oVirt and Rev. Rev writers work in the Rev documentation repository. oVirt contributors work in the oVirt documentation repository. And there's a manual sync process, and this is what it looks like. So we have a manual sync process, plus a large workload for the writers, meaning that we've got a lot to do, and we don't get to manually sync stuff. And that means that oVirt does not get doc updates very often. How can we fix this? Rev writers and oVirt contributors will both work in the oVirt documentation repository. The Rev documentation repository will get updates automatically mirrored from the oVirt documentation repository. So, let's talk about the benefits. For the oVirt community, Rev improvements will be available to the oVirt community more often. Rev writers will be more active on the oVirt site, enabling more interaction with the community. For Rev customers, the changes implemented by the oVirt community can be available to the downstream customers as often as to the community, because community contributions are already present in the repo, which is different from the downstream first model, where writers need to manually merge community content, which does not usually occur in a timely manner. So I want to talk about the migration process now. So how close are we to being done? Well, we're almost there. I'm going to talk about what we've done and what we're in the middle of doing and what we still need to do. So, our document set is ready for sharing the source code. Text variables for URLs and conventions are in place. For example, in the following sentence, engine name evaluates to the word engine on oVirt and manager on Rev. So the sentence is, install the engine name. And you see it's enclosed by curly brackets, so that indicates that it's a text variable. So in the oVirt documentation, that sentence will say, install the engine. And in the Rev documentation, it'll say, install the manager. So licensing requirements. We need to add a legal notice to the Rev docs, and we need to update the oVirt docs to the Creative Commons 4.0 license. We have a script to sync oVirt and RevDoc repos. This is already almost there. The only thing that remains is to do some final testing after we've confirmed that the oVirt doc repo is fully up to date. Basically, sanity testing. We also need to finish up implementing automation that will run that script to copy the oVirt repo to the Rev repo at regular intervals. Red Hat DevOps is actively working on setting up an automation job for this. So I'm hopeful that it will be done. Maybe it's already done. I don't know yet. We have to sync the two doc repos. So after we've got all that stuff in place and we're ready to make the move, we need to do one final sync. It shouldn't take too long. We've synced recently, so there's a few new changes to copy over from Rev to oVirt, but that's not a big deal. And then once we've done that, we can, and all the automation is set up, then we can start working directly in the oVirt doc repo. And when we're done, when we're actually working in the repo, we can publish some documentation contribution guidelines. There's already a PR that I created, and it will be finished after the migration. The only reason for that is because it's not something that should hold up the migration. So, now let's talk about contributing to oVirt docs. So, if you can, and if you want to, then we want you to contribute to oVirt documentation. We want to make it easy for you and to give you tools to get your PRs merged as quickly as possible. These next slides provide some writing tips to give you a head start. But if you don't follow these tips, it's okay. Your contribution might take longer to get merged, but it still will happen. So let me just explain that. I'll go into more detail in the next slides. But there are certain things that we need to make sure are present in documentation before it can be merged to the Red Hat Virtualization product documentation. So these next slides will show you how to get there more quickly, or help us to get there more quickly is more accurate. So let's talk about modular documentation. Modules have structured information. There are three main types of information: concepts, procedures, and reference material. So let's talk about examples of what those things are. So in this user story, we're talking about how to cross the road, and we're going to talk about it in a structured way. So if we're talking about how to cross the road, then two examples of concept modules would be what are roads and what are crossings. Examples of procedure modules would be how to put one foot in front of another, how to use pedestrian traffic lights, how to see if the road is clear for crossing. And reference modules would be types of information like a list of crossing signals with pictures of what they look like and descriptions of what they mean. Common crosswalk pavement markings, crossing laws by country. So, that was talking about structured information. Now, what is modular documentation? It's about writing in useful chunks of information. For example, if we go back to the previous slide, how to put one foot in front of another, or putting one foot in front of another. That's an example of one useful type of information. You could read the information on putting one foot in front of the other, and it's standalone. You don't need to read how to use pedestrian traffic lights in order to learn how to put one foot in front of another. So when you structure information and put them into modules like that, then it makes it easier to read. It's easier to find answers to specific questions that the user might have, both when reading, in other words, when you're actually looking through the documentation and trying to find information in the documentation, or even when you're using a search engine like Google. So, modules and assemblies. What is an assembly? An assembly is when you take a bunch of modules and you assemble them together. So it's another type of file. So an assembly, in this example, we've got 3 different assemblies and several different types of modules. And the purpose of this is to show how we can take one module, which as I said is a standalone piece of information, and share it amongst multiple assemblies. Now an assembly usually it is a user's story. It describes how to do something more complex than what one module would explain. So in this case we have 3 assemblies. Assembly 1 includes some introduction information, and then it includes include statements, same way that you have in code. You can include modules within an assembly. So it calls to module A, module B, and then module C. And then after that, it's got a section on additional resources or related information, whatever. So we've got 3 different assemblies with similar constructions. And you can see that module C, which is circled in red, is being shared between assembly 1 and assembly 2, whereas assembly 1, not whereas, but you can also see that assembly 1 is nested within assembly 3. So assembly 3 includes module G, followed by everything that we saw in assembly 1, followed by module H, and then some additional resources. Now, all of this information and much more is explained in more detail in the Modular Documentation Reference Guide, and I included a link here to that. And in addition to the output, which I included a link for, you can also see the actual source repo here, where you can ask questions as issues, or you can access some template files that they post. So that information is here. Now, I want to give you a few technical writing guidelines. It can happen that if you don't follow these guidelines, and you don't follow modular writing, then that's something that we would in turn have to do for you. So if you made a contribution that didn't follow those guidelines or these guidelines, then we would have to come along and take that information that you contributed and convert it into this format. So that's why I say that you can streamline the process by following these guidelines yourself. Now, there's no expectation that whatever you write won't require editing. That's just part of the process. The same is true for us. But if you follow these basic tips, it can give you a head start. And so let's take it away. First of all, talk directly to your user. Use the second person, which means you. So, do say you can download oVirt. Don't say oVirt can be downloaded. Don't say the user can download oVirt. Say you can download oVirt. You want to tell the user what to do directly and succinctly. So, for instance, say open port 123. Don't say port 123 should be opened. Not only is that more words to say the same thing, it's also not as clear. If you mean do something, then say it. Say do this thing. Use lists to enable readability in scanning. So, for instance, on the left side, we have a short sentence. It says, you can format text using bold, italics, underlining, and strike-through. But when I look at the right-hand side, I don't even have to read the whole thing, but I already see the bold, italics, underlining, and strike-through. And you can use the following text format. So my eye actually jumped first to the list, And I saw the information that was being included, and then it took me back and I read the intro section. Not everybody reads that way, but the point is that the list allows very quick scanning, and it makes it clear that you're providing a list of things, whereas the sentence on the left, it's not as clear that you're just providing a list of things at first glance. Don't use big words where a little one will do. This is a real pet peeve of mine. This sentence uses words, the first sentence, as opposed to this sentence utilizes words. This is a difference between technical writing and academic writing, whereas in academic writing we want to sound smart and erudite. In technical writing we want to communicate whatever it is that we want to communicate in as few words and as simply and clearly as possible. Which brings us to using one term to refer to one thing. When I joined the team, here's an example. When I joined the team, I didn't know that a self-hosted engine was the same thing as a hosted engine. And these, by the way, are two terms that are very, very close to each other. Also, in Rev, we refer to the engine as the manager, whereas in oVirt, it is the engine. So these are examples of using multiple terms to refer to the same thing. And to this day, this information is very confusing to everyone, any writers anyway, that onboard. And I would believe the same is true of any oVirt users that onboard or Rev users that onboard. So try to avoid this kind of confusion in your writing. Try to avoid things like also called blah, blah, blah. Just try to use one term and stick with it. Now, having said this, if in the normal parlance multiple terms are used to mean similar things, you have to take that into account. If you're trying to use one term and you just can't manage it for some reason, the important thing is to do it as clearly as you can. Use tables to simplify parsing information. So when the type of information suggests it, use a table. They're easier to scan than paragraphs. Now, I didn't include a table here. I should have, but I was running out of time. So I included a few guidelines here. Make sure that each column is labeled with a meaningful header. Avoid putting too much text into any one table cell. And although different columns can have different types of information, each column should have the same type of information throughout. So, for example, avoid mixing return values and fruits in one column. Now, like I said, these were just a few basic tips. I found a couple of very good online tech writing tutorials for engineers. Google offers 2 very effective yet basic tutorials in technical writing. They estimate that each tutorial takes between 2 to 5 hours. I recommend that you set aside 1 workday for taking these courses, and that will help you get your documentation PRs merged much more quickly. And here are links to those topics, those tutorials. Well, first of all, let's start out by taking a look on the right and see what Linus Torvalds has to say about ASCII Doc. He says, it's actually readable by humans. It's easier to parse and way more flexible than XML. So, ASCII Doc is a text-based markup language with a .adoc file extension. It's similar to Markdown. It's the markup language for oVirt and Rev documentation. Some websites like GitHub render ASCII Doc files directly into HTML. And finally, I included a link to extensive information on how to write with ASCII Doc. So then, what is ASCII Doctor? Well, ASCII Doctor is like a compiler. It includes language extensions to ASCII Doc. It generates output, including HTML, PDF, EPUB, DocBook, and ManPage. And there's a couple of links here so you can see even more. There's the ASCII Doctor website, which, by the way, includes the documentation for ASCII Doc. And here's also a link to their GitHub repo. So, if you've got any questions about ASCII Doc or ASCII Doctor, and you can't find answers in the documentation, then you can open an issue with a question about it. I've done that in the past and gotten answers pretty quickly. I want to give you a taste of ASCII Doc. It's powerful, but it's easy to get started. For example, here's a simple ASCII Doc file. Even if I wasn't to explain anything and I just gave you a minute or two to read through this, I think that you could get a good sense of how to write headings and how to write plain paragraph text and how to make links and even bullets. But let me move on. Let's make it clear. So this is a heading level 1. You can see it just uses a single equal sign followed by a space and then the text for the heading. Here's a heading 2. It uses 2 equal signs. Now, let me ask you a question. I'm not going to answer it here, but what if you wanted to write a heading level 3? Can you guess what you would do to do that? Well, I'm going to give it away. You would use 3 equal signs. Now here is a link. This is the way we write a link. So I didn't circle exactly just the link. I also circled the text surrounding it. So I'm not going to get into exactly how it is, except saying that for a link, you would include the entire URL of whatever it is that you're linking to. And here we get into an unordered list. It's pretty simple. You've got an introductory sentence followed by a carriage return, 2 carriage returns, and then list items that are demarcated by asterisks. That's how you make an unordered list. A numbered list, this example is a little bit more complex, but I think you can get the hang of it. An unordered list uses a dot or a period at the beginning of the sentence, followed by a space, and ASCII Doctor will turn that into a numbered list item. But in this example, as you can see, there's also an example of nested lists. So I show the first one is an example of a nested unordered list, and the second is an example of a nested ordered list. And you can see that ASCII Doctor automatically translates the nested list into the format that you see on the right-hand side, which is a lettered format, A and B. I'm not going to get into all the extensions and customizations and how powerful things are actually, because I just want to help you get started. So if you're wondering about how to change list styles, this is not the place. Okay, so that was ASCII Doc and ASCII Doctor. And now, finally, I want to just get into some guidelines on making documentation contributions to oVirt. So, here are the criteria for accepting documentation contributions. The information must be technically accurate. It must be reviewed and or edited by a Red Hat Virtualization writer. It must conform to the IBM Style Guide and the Red Hat Style Guide. It must conform to the Modular Documentation Guide. And finally, any procedures have been verified by QE. Now, this might seem like a lot, but let's talk about this in the real world. Technically accurate, that is your guys' responsibility. If you're making a contribution, then it should really be a technically accurate contribution. And the way to make sure about that is to do a technical review after you submit the PR. After it's technically accurate, then we'll talk about, well, we won't talk about here, but the guidelines on the website will explain how to communicate to the Red Hat Virtualization writers that the contribution is ready for a writer's review. And then I'm showing you the things that we need to make sure that it adheres to, the standards that it adheres to before we can merge it. So we have style guides. I'm not talking about style guides here because I don't want to make it difficult for you. I'm just sharing this with you so that you can understand the kinds of things that we're doing. In addition to making sure that the technical writing that is well written, it conforms to these style guides and it conforms to the modular documentation guide that I spoke about earlier. And procedures, like I said, they need to be verified by QE before we can merge it. So, this is the way that I see the doc contribution flow working. You will submit a PR, you'll request a technical review, and implement those review comments. That will be from the community. And then after that, you can request an editorial review from the Red Doc team. The Red Doc team will review the PR and either send comments or make direct edits in the PR. And when it meets all the submission criteria, then the Red Doc team will merge the PR. So that's it for now. So thank you very much for watching.